B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins News and Comment. It's Wednesday, June 20th, 2018. After damaging human beings, political fortunes, and America's reputation, Trump today did an about-face, and he signed an executive order that he says will end family separation of those picked up along the southern border. But it's in direct conflict with the court ruling that prevents families from being locked up together. At least there are certain limitations on it. And there are loopholes in the executive order that limit compliance to available resources and things like that. So he created this firestorm. He loaded up the fuel, he lit the match, and he roasted his own marshmallows, or maybe it was his own nuts, over this fire. And he was propelled by Steve Miller and Jeff Sessions and other nativists who said you can't lose by dumping on immigrants, by treating them cruelly, and by taking this big stand for security at the southern border. The Washington Post noted that the administration changed its position 14 times in a single week. And actually yesterday, they were starting to get the message points down about how this is just an unintended consequence of the zero-tolerance policy and that we hate separating children from their parents. This is awful, evil, and we want Congress to fix it. Well, Trump issued this order, and like so many, there's a lot of bullshit in it. But if it is carried out, what we're going to see is that the zero-tolerance policy will continue, he threatens, but we are going to bend the rules to incarcerate families together. Now, the ruling that I referred to goes back to the 1990s, the Flora settlement from 1997, that limits the government's ability to keep children in detention and orders them to be placed in least restrictive settings possible. And a subsequent ruling in 2016 bars the government from keeping children in family detention centers for more than 20 days. And so they're going to flout that court ruling. And I learned some interesting details from a PBS interview last night with Janet Napolitano. She was the director of Homeland Security under Obama. She's now president of the University of California system. And doing a mixed job there, I might add. At any rate, she clarified that under Obama, the individuals who were picked up, who didn't qualify for asylum or who hadn't had an asylum hearing yet, they were prosecuted under civil law as a misdemeanor. And typically, they were released on one side of the border or the other, only on the U.S. side if they were granted asylum. That's the official policy. I'm sure there are many variances on the implementation of the policy. But Trump's zero tolerance is not a civil proceeding, it is criminal. And that puts those suspects in the custody of U.S. Marshals once they have been arraigned. So, we've got ICE picking up the families, peeling off the children, handing them off to the Department of Health and Human Services, Refugee Resettlement, Office of Refugee, and I can't remember what the other R stands for. But the adults are put into the criminal side of our justice system, and then they are made the wards of the U.S. Marshals Service. And this makes even more complicated the reconnection of these separated families because these agencies don't have smooth ways of communicating with each other. So it'll be interesting to see if this is more than just a photo op and window dressing to try to dampen the flames without actually putting out the fire. And because I don't trust Trump, nobody should. We will have to wait and see how it plays out. And one example of the hate that has been unleashed in this episode came from former Trump campaign manager Corey Lewandowski. He was over on Fox News lying for the president, trying to defend this indefensible claim that it's all the Democrats' fault that kids are being peeled away from their parents at the border. And he got into an exchange with a Democratic strategist named Zach Butkanis, and I don't know too much about Zach. But Zach started saying, I read today about a 10-year-old girl with Down syndrome who was taken from her mother and put in a cage. And mocking that information and the empathy that Butkanis was displaying, Lewandowski mimicked the sound of the, a French horn or, I don't know. It's in cartoons. When you want to make a sad sound, you go, wah, wah, wah. And so Butkanis said, did you say wah, wah, wah? How dare you? How dare you? How absolutely dare you? And when pressed for an apology, Lewandowski said, well, I owe an apology to the children whose parents are putting them in a position that is forcing them to be separated. And this is the kind of irrational argument that's been advanced by all of these members of the Trump administration. And we learned today that Microsoft employees have notified management that they are protesting the company's work with ICE. They've asked the company to end a $19 million contract that Microsoft has with ICE for processing data and unknown artificial intelligence capabilities. The workers call the separation of families inhumane. As the people who build the technologies that Microsoft profits from, we refuse to be complicit. We are part of a growing movement comprised of many across the industry who recognize the grave responsibility that those creating powerful technology have to ensure what they build is used for good and not for harm. Meanwhile, the immigration sweeps continue across the country. In Ohio today, 145 workers at 4 different meatpacking plants owned by Fresh Market were the subject of a raid, and they will be put on buses and be processed for deportation. Fresh Market, by the way, is part of the ICE Mutual Agreement Program, in which the Homeland Security people work with private companies to prevent the hiring of undocumented workers. And we know that the meatpacking industry, led by Swift, is rife with immigrants who are recruited to come and work here because they can't get Americans to do this work. And these companies have been skirting the law and breaking the law and hiring undocumented people for years. And we claim that employers get sanctioned when they do that. Would somebody please show me a recent example of an employer who has been dinged for employing so-called illegals? And you may know the UN has a Human Rights Council. It has a checkered record. It's often been dominated by human rights violators, and it's not perfect. But in an expression of pique, anger, at comments from the High Commissioner of Human Rights, Zaid Rad al-Hussein, criticizing the U.S. immigration policies that have separated families and become an international controversy, well, this has led Nikki Haley, the UN ambassador, to announce yesterday that the United States is withdrawing from the UN Human Rights Council. And she blamed it on critics of Israel, who she said show a chronic bias by trying to use the Human Rights Council to criticize Israel for its brutal treatment of Palestinians and the deaths in Gaza, mainly by sniper fire, of more than 100 Palestinians in recent months. And this has the effect of further isolating the United States from the international community, leaving us as an outlier on human rights. And even a Zionist American member of Congress, Eliot Engel, ranking Democratic member of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, said, well, the Human Rights Council has always been a problem. Instead of focusing on real human rights issues, the Council has used its time and resources to bully Israel and question Israel's legitimacy as a sovereign state. Now, I certainly don't agree with him on that, but consider his posture there. And he said, The way to deal with this challenge is to remain engaged, work with partners to push for change. By withdrawing, we lose our leverage and allow the Council's bad actors to follow their worst impulses unchecked. And at Human Rights Watch, Kenneth Roth, the executive director, said the Human Rights Council has played an important role in countries like North Korea, Syria, Myanmar, and South Sudan, but all Trump seems to care about is defending Israel. And it shows how thin-skinned the United States has become because we have a thin-skinned president. And, again, we are further isolating ourselves from the world community on policy, and then we'll get to trade in a few minutes here. Somebody is claiming mentorship of the dark force in the White House, Stephen Miller. And that is the ever-odious David Horowitz, who is a liberal turncoat, who is kind of a provocateur, goes around to college campuses issuing right-wing fatwas, essentially. And I've had some encounters with Horowitz over the years. I stopped talking with him after a second or third interview I did with him in the 1990s. Because I thought, it might be interesting, controversial to talk to somebody who's a former liberal, a former supporter of the Black Panthers. But he is simply an opportunist who will take any opportunity, any opening, to try to drive through far-right perspectives. So he's the guy who found Steve Miller, met him when Miller was still in high school in Santa Monica. He helped him get the job in Jeff Sessions' office. And, of course, Jeff Sessions helped get Stephen Miller into the Trump White House. And we can thank David Horowitz for all this. Now, while we've been distracted by this contrived and concocted controversy, there's a lot going on in Washington. Now, there's no real progress on an immigration bill. They're planning a vote as soon as tomorrow, but I don't expect it to go very far. But Trump continues to chip away at Obamacare. He issued some new rules to allow small businesses to set up health insurance plans based on associations. So if you're an insurance agent, you and other insurance agents can band together to buy crappy health care. And this is health care that would be cheaper than Obamacare, but the policies may not provide essential health benefits like mental health care, emergency room services, maternity and newborn care, or prescription drugs. And, of course, that makes these very catastrophic policies that only kick in when you're at death's door. And this is just the latest attack on Obamacare. It is going down eventually, I'm sorry to say. As you know, I'm a critic of Obamacare because it didn't do enough. It cemented the insurance industry's control over health care, fed them millions of new customers with government subsidies, didn't provide any way of negotiating drug prices, prescription drug prices. But it was better than nothing. And there is no path to single payer at this point. So a lot of people are going to get the message that Alan Grayson, the combative former Florida congressman, once said on the floor of the House, that the Republican health care plan is that you should just die. Well, there are three big corporate entities that have banded together. You may have heard about this earlier this year. Amazon, owned by Jeff Bezos or controlled by him, Berkshire Hathaway, and J.P. Morgan Chase. They have formed their own independent health care company, and they announced today that they are hiring Dr. Atul Gawande as the chief executive of the company. Now, maybe you've heard of this guy. He's a professor at Harvard, and he's a surgeon at Brigham and Women's Hospital. He's also written for The New Yorker, and he's written several books. I saw him speak at a book event a few years ago. This guy is smart. He is compassionate. And I believe the book he had written was about elder care for his father. So I'm open to these new approaches. The system is broken, and even corporate entities recognize that the government is not going to find a path to solutions for these very serious problems. Meanwhile, the trade war that Trump has started is heating up, and it's neat to see Republicans attack Republicans. Wilbur Ross, the ancient Secretary of Commerce in the Trump administration, was up on Capitol Hill defending the trade war against criticism from stalwart Republicans like Orrin Hatch of Utah. Hatch said, "Know that you are taxing American families, you're putting American jobs at risk, and you're destroying markets, both foreign and domestic." We also heard from Pat Leahy, Democrat of Vermont, "I wish we would stop invoking national security as the basis for these tariffs, because that's not what this is about." Oh, excuse me, I just quoted the wrong Pat there. That was Pat Toomey, the pro-business, corporate-owned senator from Pennsylvania. He said, this is about economic nationalism. John Thune of South Dakota, a member of GOP leadership, told Ross, this thing seems to be escalating out of control fairly quickly. And Colorado Senator Michael Bennet, what is it about the Canadian steel industry that is a national security threat? And Ross acknowledged that in terms of dollar value, the U.S. actually has a trade surplus in steel with Canada. But he said the administration's approach is necessary to engage other nations in putting up barriers to China's practice of routing steel and aluminum through other countries to get into the U.S. markets. And even the woman who likes to wrestle hogs, Joni Ernst, the Iowa Republican, these aggressive trade actions will continue to have damaging consequences, including an impact on our commodity prices, farm futures, and increasing anxiety among the agricultural and business communities in Iowa. There was an interesting little mini revolt. This is fairly symbolic. But you may know that Trump has proposed, in the interests of fiscal integrity, that after passing the huge corporate tax cuts and running a budget with a huge deficit, they want to cut $15 billion, which is not even a drop in a bucket. And the money was going to come, at least half of that, from the Children's Health Insurance Fund, mostly from an expired account that can no longer be used. I don't understand that. That's what makes this symbolic. But Senator Richard Burr, the Republican from North Carolina, and Senator Susan Collins of Maine, also a Republican, provided 2 no votes that led to the failure of this measure. That's a little bit surprising. We have not seen that kind of independence from these Republicans lately. Every day I pause for a moment to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. Wonderful Americans like Wendy Gebauer, Abby McMillan, Paul Tomaselli, and Faith Peoples. I invite you to join them. We're observing my 9 years of podcasting this month, looking for 9 new subscribers to help support my work. All you have to do is visit peterbcollins.com, find the menu tab, pull it down, click on Become a Subscriber. You'll end up on the sign-up page, and in a minute or two, you can choose a level of support that's comfortable for you. Allergic to PayPal? Yo comprende. You can you can write to me, put a stamp on it in the U.S. mail, and you can set up a subscription or make payments. Just use Box 150, 660, San Rafael, California, 94915. Box 150, 660, San Rafael, California, 94915. Well, Kim Jong-un has returned to North Korea after his 3rd visit to Beijing in the past few months. And it appears that he is getting messages from the Chinese leadership and President Xi to shift his focus onto trade and economic development for North Korea. And this fits nicely with China's ambitious initiative called One Belt, One Road, where they're paying for infrastructure projects in other countries that are being built by Chinese companies. They're active in Central and South America, in Africa, and they could also get involved in North Korea. Now, the U.S. imposed sanctions are an impediment to that right now, But the coverage notes that the North Korean propaganda has shifted. They are not demonizing the United States or Trump the way they have in the past, and they are promoting unification of the Korean Peninsula. They don't talk about the terms, about whether Kim Jong-un would step down and allow South Korea to run the entire reunified nation, or do they imagine it would be the other way around? In either case, there's very little talk about denuclearization, about the Singapore communique that was signed by Trump and Kim, and it appears to be fading with little action behind the big optics of the summit that was just a couple of weeks ago. But the gnashing of teeth over Trump's impulsive cancellation of the war games that the U.S. and South Korea put on every year, this is something that I advocated the United States should have voluntarily proposed as a sweetener before the Singapore meetings. So I'm not shocked or upset that Trump did this. I think the war games are a waste of time and money, and they are just drama to try to keep North Korea on its proverbial toes. But the corporate media keeps pounding away. Here's a story by the AP today that showed up in my local San Francisco Chronicle. Headline, halting military exercises are risky gamble, experts say. And they quote a South Korean military commentator, Lee Il-woo, describing the halt as temporarily pulling off the wheels of the alliance. Other experts agree, they're not named here or quoted, that the suspension will weaken at least temporarily the Allies' defense posture against North Korea and open gaps in their combined deterrence. Well, come on. We're told that these war games are largely video games. And they could conduct those on the South Pole if they really felt they're so essential. Congratulations to Canada. You have survived the recent attacks on your Prime Minister by the Donald, and you have moved forward to become the second country in the world to fully legalize marijuana. Yesterday, an historic vote ends 90 years of prohibition of cannabis in Canada. The bill passed 52 to 29 in the Canadian Senate on Tuesday, and they're going to move forward very quickly. They're planning an 8 to 12-week period before retail sales will begin. And I contrast this with California, that legalized adult use of marijuana for any purpose, medical or recreational, and that went into effect a year and a half ago. And just last night, I was conducting an interview for our local TV channel with two people who are duking it out over a small town, 7,500 village called Fairfax. Fairfax has a single medical marijuana dispensary. And a former mayor is pushing an initiative, a voter initiative, that would force the town council to end the delays, the moratorium that's been imposed, and move forward with legalization of retail sales. It is amazing to me to see how we can work so hard to change the law, and then elected leaders slow walk the implementation of those changes. Meanwhile, the real drug problem in this country is OxyContin, the very powerful painkiller that is highly addictive. OxyContin is the signature product of Purdue Pharma, which is owned by the Sackler family, and today they announced that they've laid off the entire sales force. Now, a couple of months ago, they laid off about 2/3 of their salespeople and redirected the rest to sell other pharmaceutical drugs, including those that help deal with constipation caused by regular use of oxycodone drugs. And I don't know about you, but I first found out about that during the Super Bowl in 2017 when they ran a commercial for constipation caused by opioids. I didn't know it was a problem, and I didn't know there was a pharmaceutical solution. But that's Purdue. They'll get you all plugged up and then sell you a drug to relieve the problem. And the Sackler family, of course, is fighting lawsuits on many fronts. They are reportedly worth $13 billion, and most of that came from the sale of this single drug. And last week we mentioned that the Attorney General in Massachusetts, Maura Healey, is filing a lawsuit against Purdue and has named the individual members of the Sackler family as co-defendants. I think that's a worthwhile and justified move. Today I'm releasing an in-depth interview with Harvard professor of history Serhiy Plokhý. And I think you'll find this fascinating. His new book is all about the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. And while it's a gripping, riveting account of the accident that occurred there in April of 1986, he also makes a strong case that the Soviet Union's bungled reaction to the Chernobyl disaster led to glasnost, led to, ultimately, the breakdown of the Soviet Union. Here's an excerpt from my interview with Serhiy Plokhý.
Well, thanks. Indeed, this is one of key arguments of the book, which is based on linking the Chernobyl disaster to the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And the broader idea is that major technological disasters, they really can bring about collapse of states, even powerful states. In the case of the Soviet Union, it would be, of course, absolutely incorrect and irresponsible, especially for a professor, to say that there was just one reason for the fall of a major superpower. So explaining the fall of the Soviet Union through Chernobyl alone wouldn't be right. But explaining the fall of the Soviet Union without Chernobyl wouldn't be right either.
I invite you to listen to the full interview with Professor Plokhý from Harvard. I'm releasing it to my subscribers today at peterbcollins.com, iTunes, TuneIn, Stitcher, and Spreaker. And 30-plus years after Chernobyl, we are finding that radioactivity readings in milk produced from local cows are still up to 5 times the government's official limits for adults, more than 12 times the limit of background radiation for children. And so the damage continues, and there are ghost towns in the region around Chernobyl that will remain ghost towns. Not too much going on the Russiagate narrative. We're kind of in a lull right now. New York Times is reporting that Rudy Giuliani, Mr. 9/11, has been interviewed by the special counsel Robert Mueller's investigating team to see if he was the source of leaks from the FBI office in New York during the 2016 campaign. Those leaks indicated that there were angry agents who were pissed at James Comey for exonerating, failing to prosecute Hillary Clinton over the email scandal. And in the fall, Rudy Giuliani was dropping little teasers that there was going to be more information coming. And it appeared to be linked to his sources among people in the New York FBI office. A long time ago, Rudy Giuliani was the U.S. attorney there, so it's not really out of the question that he might have known about this. And let's see. In the fall of 16, he told Lars Larson, the right-wing radio host from Portland. The other rumor I get is there's kind of a revolution going on inside the FBI about the original conclusion being completely unjustified, almost a slap in the face of the FBI's integrity. Giuliani went on, I know that from former agents, I know even from a few active agents who don't want to identify themselves, and it trails off from there. Love to see Rudy get his own indictment from Robert Mueller. And there is a new story at The Guardian today. A longtime American lobbyist for the Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska is described as Julian Assange's most frequent visitor in the last couple of years. He's a Washington lobbyist named Adam Waldman, and The Guardian does show that he's been connected with Deripaska, who was also connected to Manafort. But there is no indication that Manafort and this guy Waldman had any direct connections. And so this is circumstantial evidence that Waldman made repeated visits to see Julian Assange in 2017. Now, perhaps he was trying to broker a deal to get Julian out of the Ecuadorian embassy and to help clear Trump by clarifying that WikiLeaks did not get the information that was stolen from the DNC from Russian intelligence. None of that has ever occurred, but that is as likely an explanation as the kind of implied indictment that's coming from The Guardian against Assange today. BuzzFeed broke a story a couple of days ago about an unknown White House official named Joe Hagan. And Hagan has been a top aide to President Trump. He worked in both Bush administrations. He's an old-line Republican operator. He's been Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, and he is resigning to spend more time with his family. And his family includes his wife, Sarah Bronfman, the heir to the Bronfman liquor fortune. And she has been a funder of the murky so-called celebrity sex cult, which is spelled NXIVM. And somebody told me how to pronounce it, but I'm blocking on it right now, so you figure that out. Anyway, I cannot link him to the sex cult. His wife apparently helped keep the cult afloat with tens of millions of dollars in funding. And he says that he heard about some of their meetings but didn't go to them. So we'll see if there's more there, but he is leaving the administration. From time to time, I like to share with you coverage of the same story from two outlets. And today we look at the violence in Nicaragua, which, according to the New York Times, is the fault of President Daniel Ortega, the former revolutionary leader in Nicaragua. And if you rely only on the New York Times, you'll understand that there is a police chief who's being held hostage in the town of Masaya, and that they have sent troops and paramilitary to try to free him. And here's a quote from the Times article. "It's been 2 months since Nicaraguans rose up in an enormous wave to demand the end of Ortega's leadership, a repudiation of the man who has dominated the country's political life for nearly 40 years. What is emerging is a campaign of terror by government-backed paramilitary forces, often accompanied by anti-riot police, that appears to be calculated to cow citizens into resignation." I've linked to the New York Times story so you can read it for yourselves. I'm also linking to Max Blumenthal's powerful expose at the Gray Zone Project. Headline, U.S. government meddling machine boasts of laying the groundwork for insurrection in Nicaragua. And we're familiar with the National Endowment for Democracy, which is boasting of spending millions of dollars, quote, laying the groundwork for insurrection against Ortega. Blumenthal writes, in early June, Nicaragua's leading young activists went on a junket to Washington. They were paid. The trip was paid for by Freedom House, which is another one of our pro-democracy front groups linked to the National Endowment for Democracy, and USAID is the other entity that essentially provides covert funding that, or at least partly covert or partly public, that the CIA doesn't want to take on itself. So this is a fascinating article, and I think what you'll see here is the fine hand of Uncle Sam, once again practicing gunboat and banana republic-type diplomacy or operations in Central America. And we read that the NED has spent over $4 million in Nicaragua since 2014, helping grow 54 groups into major players on the political scene, and the language laying the groundwork for insurrection comes from a memo written by an American NED operative. So it's a fascinating second look, a different look, alternate facts, if you like that, available now on the situation in Nicaragua. And finally today, Gizmodo has an excellent report on a political struggle here in California. There are two members of the state Senate who have drafted good legislation, and they've merged the two bills together, which would establish net neutrality as the law of the state of California. And the two bills that have been merged include the language of the federal order that was the basis for net neutrality, and about 300 pages of description and terms that make that effective. But those merged bills are before a committee that is controlled by a California member of the Assembly, Miguel Santiago, chair of the Communications and Conveyance Committee. He has received some pretty hefty campaign contributions from AT&T. And even Nancy Pelosi is concerned that Santiago is trying to scuttle the essential elements of the California net neutrality bill, which would prohibit companies that violate net neutrality from doing business with the state of California. That is a major enforcement cudgel. So Santiago appears to be planning to write his own bill, which will not include the details and the protections required to make net neutrality a real law that has impact in California and beyond our borders. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. We give it away free. You're free to share it far and wide, and you'll find it on YouTube. I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.